Introduction. Most people walk past the quiet ones, the ones who sit at the back of the room, the ones who stay long after the crowd is gone, the ones the world forgets. But Grace Jenkins? She noticed them. She was only 16, a junior in high school, thrilled to land her first job at the Starlight Coffee Shop, the coolest cafe near Times Square. She thought she'd be learning how to steam milk and make perfect lattes. Instead, she was about to learn something much bigger: how to see the people no one else sees, and how a simple act of kindness can change everything. This is the story of how a teenage girl, a group of strangers, and a dream that started after closing time turned a coffee shop into a place where no one was invisible. Chapter 1. First Shifts and First Impressions. Grace Jenkins could barely contain her excitement. Her first real job, her own paycheck, her own schedule, a little independence. At 16, she was ready to stop asking her mom for money every time she wanted to grab bubble tea with her friends or buy a new journal from the stationery store down the block. And this wasn't just any job. The Starlight Coffee Shop was the place to be. Nestled just a few streets off Times Square, it attracted everyone: tourists, NYU students, off-duty Broadway performers, and plenty of influencers snapping photos under the cafe's neon galaxy mural. When Grace landed the job, she felt like she'd stepped into a dream. Her first week was a whirlwind, learning how to pull espresso shots without flooding the machine, memorizing regulars' complicated drink orders, smiling through long lines and longer shifts. Her coworkers were a mix of characters: Carmen, warm, funny, always sneaking her extra whipped cream; Zay, quiet but quick to jump in and help when the line stretched to the door; and Todd, the oldest of the bunch, who never smiled unless it was sarcastic. By the end of her second week, Grace had learned how to work the register, prep pastries, and make the perfect caramel drizzle pattern on a latte. She was starting to feel like she belonged. But there was something, or rather someone, that caught her eye. Several someones, actually. Every day, scattered at different tables, sat a group of people who didn't quite fit in with the rest of the crowd. An older woman with silver hair tucked under a scarf who sat near the window knitting something invisible. A young man with deep brown eyes and a journal that seemed to hold the weight of the world. A middle-aged man with a salt and pepper beard who always read the same weathered book. They never ordered much, usually just a small black coffee or a day-old pastry. But they stayed, all day, quiet, watching, waiting for something or someone. Most customers didn't notice them. The staff barely acknowledged them. But Grace did. One afternoon during a lull between the lunch and after-school rush, she leaned over to Todd. "Who are they?" she asked softly, nodding toward the quiet regulars. Todd didn't even glance up from wiping the counter. "Bums," he said flatly. "Freeloaders. They hang around, buy almost nothing, and take up space." Grace frowned. The words stung. They didn't look like freeloaders. They looked tired, like they were holding on to something small and precious in a city that asked too much. She didn't press Todd further, but in her heart the question remained. Who were they really? And why did they stay? Grace was determined to find out. Chapter 2. Faces in the Crowd. The next week, between latte art and wiping tables, Grace started watching the regulars more closely. Not in a nosy way, in a curious, caring way. Most customers came and went in a blur, but these few, her quiet crew, as she'd started calling them in her mind, were constant. There was Miss Eloise, always sitting by the window, knitting needles flashing in steady rhythm. Her scarf changed color every few days, bright reds and oranges that stood out against her worn gray coat. The other baristas thought she was just passing time, but Grace noticed how Eloise's eyes tracked the door like clockwork, waiting, hoping. One slow afternoon, as Grace wiped down the window table, Eloise spoke without looking up. "I used to meet my son here, before the city swallowed him up." Her voice was steady, strong, but the weight behind the words pressed into Grace's heart. At the tall communal table sat James, mid-30s, notebook always open, pen tapping against the paper like a heartbeat. He wore the same dark jacket every day, frayed at the cuffs, but his hair was always combed neatly to the side. One evening, when most customers had cleared out, Grace saw what he was writing. Song lyrics. Dozens of pages, filled with words aching to be heard. "I had a band once," he told her when he caught her glancing. "Before the rent went up, before the gigs dried up, before life changed." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. The words stuck around, even when everything else didn't. And then there was Griffin. No one knew if that was her real name, a nickname, or a title. She sat by the bookshelf near the back wall with her walker by her side. Silver gray hair twisted into a loose crown braid. A small, worn messenger bag always rested on the floor beside her. Most days she read. Sometimes she scribbled in a weathered leather journal, its pages so thick with use it barely closed. But when Griffin spoke, she stood, slowly, painfully. Her back straightened, her shoulders squared, and it felt like the entire coffee shop got a little quieter. Even the hum of the espresso machine seemed to hush. "I was a poet once," she said one evening as Grace refreshed her water. "Still am, I suppose." She handed Grace a yellowed folded clipping from a newspaper. "Griffin Walker wins National Poetry Prize." The date was older than Grace herself. "Words," Griffin continued, "have kept me standing taller than my bones allow." And indeed, when she recited a few lines, sharp, vivid, beautiful, she didn't seem small or tired. She stood like a giant. Grace felt a lump in her throat. These weren't bums. They were people holding on to family, to dreams, to legacies the city had overlooked. They weren't strangers anymore. They were neighbors the world had forgotten. And Grace, she wasn't about to forget them. Chapter 3, The Spark After Hours. By her third week at the Starlight Coffee Shop, Grace had memorized more than just drink orders. She knew that Miss Eloise arrived at exactly 9:45 every morning and always ordered a small black coffee, no sugar. James liked to sit near the tall window where the sunlight could hit his notebook. And Griffin, with her quiet strength, claimed the seat near the bookshelf like a queen returning to her throne. Grace also knew which tourists tipped well, which regulars loved oat milk, and which coworkers would swap shifts for an extra muffin. She was becoming a real barista. But her mind wasn't on caramel drizzle or perfect foam anymore. It was on them, the quiet crew. One Friday evening, after the rush died down and the neon mural dimmed to soft blue, Grace found herself wiping down the back table, the one near Griffin's bookshelf. The shop was nearly empty. Only Griffin remained, her journal open. Ms. Eloise had already left for the night. James was packing up his notebook, humming a tune only he could hear. As Grace worked, she overheard two women near the counter chatting. "They really should kick those people out. It's bad for business," one said, glancing toward Griffin. "Makes the place feel sad." Grace's stomach turned. Sad? Number? They weren't sad. They were survivors. She caught Griffin's eye. The older woman gave her a small, knowing nod, like she understood what Grace was thinking. "Words have kept me standing," she had said. Grace wiped her hands on her apron and walked to the front door. She flipped the lock early, even though they technically had 20 more minutes. She needed quiet, to think. By the time the last customer had drifted out, Grace had an idea scribbled on a napkin. Midnight at Starlight. Tapas, music, $2.50 cover. All proceeds helped the quiet crew. It was crazy. She didn't have a license. She didn't even know how to host an event. But she knew the cafe didn't close until 8 p.m. And she knew the space stayed empty until morning. What if the shop didn't have to stay empty? What if she could turn the place that kept the quiet crew warm into something more? Something joyful, something healing, something theirs. That night at home, she shared the idea with her older brother, Jaden. "You want to throw a secret event at your job?" he said, eyebrow raised. "With food, music, and my DJ gear?" "Yes," Grace replied, breathless. "Just once, maybe twice. We'll charge a tiny fee and use it to help the regulars. I'm not sure how, but we'll figure it out." Jaden looked at her. His little sister, always scribbling in journals, always noticing things others didn't. "You're lucky I love you," he sighed. "Let's do it." And just like that, Midnight at Starlight was born. Chapter 4, Midnight at Starlight begins. The week leading up to the first midnight at Starlight felt like planning a heist. Grace took closing shifts whenever she could. She sketched out a floor plan in her notebook. Where to put the DJ table, which tables to move, where to set up food trays. Her mom, after a long conversation about being responsible but bold, agreed to make small empanadas and veggie rolls for the event. If you're going to break rules, her mom said with a wink, at least feed people while you do it. Grace handed out tiny, handwritten flyers to classmates, a few friendly regulars, and some kids from the after-school music program down the street. Nothing flashy, no social media posts. This wasn't about going viral. It was about creating a space where people felt seen. Friday arrived. Carmen, sweet, loyal Carmen, agreed to cover the register until closing and then forget she saw anything. Zay gave her a secret thumbs up before leaving. Even Todd, with his usual sarcasm, grunted something that might have been approval. "Don't burn the place down," he muttered. By 8:15, the last official customer was gone. By 8:30, the tables had been rearranged. By 8:45, Jaden rolled in his DJ gear and started setting up. The first guest trickled in just after 9. A girl from Grace's math class brought a guitar. A few college students carried poetry notebooks. 2 breakdancers arrived, all energy and nerves. And then, the quiet crew came. Ms. Eloise, scarf a bold blue tonight, took her usual window seat. James carried his notebook like a passport. And Griffin? She entered slowly, walker steady, but when she paused near the DJ table, the room seemed to shift around her. "This is new," she observed, her voice as always calm but commanding. "It's for you," Grace replied, heart pounding. "For all of you." Griffin nodded. "Then let it begin." By 9:30, the room was filled with the scent of warm empanadas, the low hum of lofi beats, and the quiet buzz of anticipation. Jaden played mellow tracks. People mingled. Someone started an impromptu poetry reading. Grace walked between tables, collecting the $2.50 cover charge. No one seemed to mind, and quietly placed the bills into a glass jar labeled Mutual Joy Fund. No one sat alone. No one was ignored. Even Todd popped in around 10, leaned against the wall, and didn't say a word. As the night unfolded, Grace watched the quiet crew transform. Ms. Eloise taught a group of teens how to knit small squares. James shared his song lyrics, 2 students offering to add guitar chords. And Griffin, when she stood to read a poem, silence rippled across the room like a wave. "We are not broken. We are still being written. Our edges are tattered, yes, but our story is not over." For the first time, the quiet crew wasn't just part of the background. They were the main event. By midnight, the crowd had thinned. Laughter lingered in the air like sugar. Grace stood by the register, jar in hand, tears prickling her eyes. "You did good, sis," Jaden said, pulling her into a hug. "Real good." Midnight at Starlight was no longer just an idea. It was a beginning. Chapter 5, Growth and Rumblings. Word spread faster than Grace expected. By Monday, kids at school were whispering about that secret coffee shop event where music, poetry, and food flowed like magic. By Wednesday, a few more students asked for the next date. Even a couple of her teachers gave her knowing smiles, but said nothing. And by Friday, Midnight at Starlight had a waiting list. Grace kept the momentum going. Each Friday, she collected $2.50 from every guest and tucked the bills into the Mutual Joy Fund jar. With the first week's earnings, she bought warm socks and gloves from a discount store. The second week, she added granola bars and refillable MetroCards. She didn't just hand them out randomly, she tucked them gently into bags near the quiet crew's tables, letting them keep their dignity. "We take care of each other in this city," she whispered to herself. "We don't just survive, we thrive." The midnight events began to take on a life of their own. Local poets volunteered to read. Street musicians asked if they could perform. A girl from Grace's biology class started a sign-up list for those needing extra groceries. Even tourists who stumbled in started returning just for the Friday events. But not everyone smiled. Todd's sarcasm grew sharper. "You sure you're not running a charity instead of a coffee shop now?" he quipped one night. The cafe's assistant manager, Rachel, mentioned that someone had filed a complaint about unauthorized gatherings, probably a nearby business owner who didn't like the extra foot traffic or the late-night music. Be careful, Rachel warned quietly. The owner's going to notice sooner or later. Grace's stomach tightened. She hadn't exactly asked for permission, but how could she stop now? She wasn't just hosting an event. She was building a community, one Friday at a time. That night, as she prepared for the fourth midnight gathering, Grace noticed something new. The quiet crew wasn't just attending anymore. They were leading. Ms. Eloise organized a knitting circle that donated blankets to a nearby shelter. James started offering songwriting workshops to kids who couldn't afford music lessons. And Griffin had become the soul of the event. Her poetry wasn't just read, it was felt. "We are not shadows," she declared to a packed house. "We are lamps waiting to be lit." The crowd erupted in applause. Even Todd, leaning in his usual spot near the wall, gave a small, respectful nod. Grace smiled. She knew the risks. She knew the rules she was bending, maybe even breaking. But some things were worth it. Chapter 6. The night everything changed. The fifth midnight at Starlight felt like a festival. The air buzzed with music and laughter. Teens strummed guitars near the front windows. Griffin's poetry verses were written in chalk on the sidewalk outside. Grace arrived early, excitement blooming in her chest. The Mutual Joy Fund jar was already half full before the event even started. She moved through the crowd like a conductor. Jaden spun a mellow groove behind the DJ table. Carmen brought 2 trays of leftover pastries from the day shift. James was coaching a small group of aspiring lyricists in the back. Ms. Eloise showed a little girl how to cast on stitches for her first knitting project. Griffin stood near the mural, greeting guests like royalty. This, Grace thought, is what community looks like. But just before 10:30, the door chimed, and the air changed. Mr. Costa, the owner. He stepped inside, tall, serious, gray wool coat buttoned neatly. He didn't move quickly. He didn't have to. The entire cafe seemed to hush itself. Grace's breath caught. Her heart thudded in her ears. This wasn't like the small grumbles from Todd or Rachel's quiet warnings. This was the owner, the man who had built Starlight from a single food cart to 3 city cafes. He slowly surveyed the scene, the music, the food trays, the jar of money, the tables filled with faces the world usually overlooked. His gaze finally landed on Grace. "Miss Jenkins." She swallowed hard. "Mr. Costa, I can explain." The room held its breath as she spoke. She told him everything. The Friday nights, the $2.50 cover, the Mutual Joy Fund, the socks, the gloves, the MetroCards, the knitting circle, the songwriting group. She told him about Miss Eloise's search for her son, James's words that wouldn't be silenced, Griffin's poetry that refused to fade. "I didn't do this to break the rules," Grace said, voice trembling. "I did it because someone had to see them. Someone had to listen." The clock above the counter ticked loudly in the silence. Mr. Costa turned to Griffin. "And you?" Griffin lifted her chin, standing tall despite the walker. "I came for the coffee. I stayed for the revolution." A ripple of quiet laughter broke through the tension. Even Mr. Costa cracked a faint smile. He paced slowly to the Mutual Joy Fund jar, lifted it, weighed it in his hands. "How much did you raise?" Grace answered honestly. "Almost $400 this month. Every cent for the community." Mr. Costa nodded thoughtfully. "Miss Jenkins," he said at last, "you've broken every policy in the employee handbook." Grace's heart sank. Here it was. The end. "But," he continued, "you've honored every value this company was built on." He placed the jar back on the counter. "You should have asked for permission." "I was afraid you'd say no," she admitted. "I might have," he said, smiling faintly. "But now, I have a better idea." The crowd leaned in. Grace barely dared to breathe. "Let's make this official, once a month, sponsored by Starlight. No more secrets, no more risks. If you're going to change lives, let's do it the right way." The room erupted. Applause, cheers. Even Todd clapped, twice before crossing his arms and pretending he hadn't. Grace felt tears blur her vision. She turned to Gryphon, who simply nodded. Told you, the poet whispered. Revolution. Chapter 7. The Revolution Gets a Permit. By Monday morning, the Starlight Coffee Shop felt different. Not just to Grace, to everyone. Mr. Costa met with her before the shop opened. No lecture, no scolding, just business. If we're doing this, he said, sliding a notebook across the table, we're doing it right. He'd already drafted a proposal for the midnight events. Starlight After Hours, community, creativity, compassion, a new initiative, a real program. One location to start, maybe more if it worked. Grace blinked at the words. It didn't feel real. You've built something important, he told her. Now you need structure to keep it alive. The first official Midnight at Starlight launched 2 Fridays later. This time, with flyers designed by a local college art student. This time, with a proper sign-up sheet. This time, with the cafe's full blessing, and even some snacks donated by neighboring businesses. The Mutual Joy Fund became a proper community fund. Rachel agreed to help with the budgeting and expenses. Todd, surprisingly, volunteered to run sound equipment. I'm not reading poetry, he warned, but I'll keep things running smooth. Carmen beamed. Told you this was special. The quiet crew transformed into the midnight crew. Ms. Eloise expanded her knitting circle. Now they made hats and scarves for shelters. James helped young songwriters record demos with Jaden's equipment. And Gryphon? Gryphon became the curator of the Starlight Words wall, where anyone could post poems, lyrics, or encouraging notes. Her own poem stretched across the top in bold, swirling script. We are not shadows. We are lamps waiting to be lit. The first night of the official event drew twice the usual crowd. Tourists and locals, teens and elders, artists and quiet souls just needing a place to belong. Grace moved through the space with a clipboard in one hand and a tear in her eye. I'm not just a barista anymore, she thought. I'm a builder. As the night wound down, Mr. Costa approached her. You've done well, Grace. We've done well, she corrected, all of us. He nodded. Midnight at Starlight isn't just an event anymore. It's a movement. Grace smiled, watching Gryphon stand once more to deliver the final poem of the night. The applause rolled like thunder, and Grace knew the revolution was just getting started. Chapter 8, A Movement in Bloom. Spring arrived in New York with its usual drama, gusty winds, sudden downpours, and bursts of tulips forcing their way through cracked sidewalks. But the Starlight Coffee Shop? It was steady, a lighthouse in the storm of the city's constant change. And Midnight at Starlight? It had grown beyond anyone's expectations. The events now happened twice a month, sometimes 3 when the demand surged. What started as a quiet gathering had become a sanctuary for many. Local food vendors began donating trays of empanadas, samosas, and cookies. The university's music department sent students to perform and mentor younger artists. A small, independent bookstore offered free poetry books for the Starlight Words wall. Even the local paper ran a story, Midnight at Starlight, the coffee shop changing lives after dark. Grace barely recognized her own life. By day, she was still a student, still a junior, juggling homework and friend groups. But by night, she was a coordinator, an event planner, a bridge between generations and stories the city had nearly forgotten. The quiet crew, now the midnight crew, became cornerstones of the movement. Ms. Eloise reunited with her son after Grace quietly reached out to a local family search service. He had no idea his mother had been waiting just blocks from his apartment. Their reunion was quiet, joyful, full of tears and the scent of coffee. James began teaching songwriting workshops twice a week. Some of his students had already booked small gigs around the city. And Gryphon's poetry spread beyond the walls of the shop. A local publisher compiled her collected works into a slim, powerful volume titled Lamps Waiting to be Lit. The first reading was held naturally at Starlight. She stood tall as ever, her walker steady beside her, but her spirit towering. We are not forgotten, she told the crowd. We are found. Even Todd changed. He stopped calling them bums, stopped rolling his eyes at Grace's big dreams. One night, he handed her a small envelope. For the fun, he muttered. I DJ on the side too, you know. Inside, 2 crisp $100 bills. Grace's world had shifted in ways she never imagined, and yet she knew it was only the beginning. Kindness, Griffin had said once, is a revolution in slow motion. Grace smiled, watching the latest midnight gathering unfold, music drifting like a soft tide over the tables. Then let's keep the revolution moving. Epilogue. Lamps that never dim. 2 years later, Grace stood outside a new shop in Brooklyn Heights. The sign above the door read, "The Starlight Collective," a cafe, an art space, a community hub. Inside, the smell of coffee mingled with the scent of fresh paint and hope. The original Midnight at Starlight crew had helped design the space. Griffin's Words wall had been recreated, larger than ever. James now ran the in-house music program. Ms. Eloise taught weekly knitting classes. And Grace? She wasn't just a barista anymore. She wasn't just a student. She was the director of the Starlight Collective's community programs. On the wall behind the counter hung a framed napkin, the original yellowed from time but still legible. Midnight at Starlight. Food, music. $2.50 entry. Proceeds, shock help for the quiet crew. Some revolutions start with grand speeches. Others? They start with a girl, a notebook, and the courage to see people everyone else overlooks. In a city that never sleeps, kindness became a lamp that would never dim. In every crowd, there are stories waiting to be heard. In every quiet corner, someone is hoping to be seen. If Grace's story moved you, share it. Remind the world that kindness is not a weakness, it's a revolution. Subscribe for more inspiring stories. Leave a comment sharing a time you made a difference or when someone's kindness made a difference for you. And remember, even the smallest light can change the darkest room.